On the very first day of the grand opening of the family company I had built from the ground up, my husband suddenly seized control of the company and fired me in front of all the guests. "You're fired. Pack up all your belongings. Security will escort you out." I was stunned, but calmly I placed the visitor badge on the table and said, "Very well. Inform all staff that the board of directors will hold a meeting in 2 hours." And exactly 2 hours later, my husband was hysterically begging for mercy at my feet. But before the story begins, please write in the comments where you're watching this story from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so Stories with Meaning can continue to grow and bring you even more powerful stories. The atmosphere inside the grand ballroom of the convention center was magnificent and filled with celebration. Today was a historic day for Mrs. Natalie Wilson. After years of relentless effort, sleepless nights, and personal sacrifice, the company she had built from nothing was finally officially launched. Wilson Global Enterprises was no longer just a dream on paper, it had become a real corporation ready to compete on a national level. Natalie stood beside the stage, gazing at the hundreds of invited guests. A calm, satisfied smile rested on her composed face. The shawl she wore fluttered gently under the cool air conditioning, yet she stood tall with undeniable authority. Standing beside her was Daniel Wilson, her husband, looking sharp in his expensive tailored suit. Daniel smiled warmly at the guests, shaking hands with business partners offering congratulations. To outsiders, they looked like the perfect couple, a brilliant, visionary wife supported by a devoted husband. But Natalie had no idea that behind Daniel's smile was a carefully planned betrayal. The inauguration ceremony proceeded smoothly. The host opened the event enthusiastically, followed by thunderous applause. Natalie's heart raced with happiness as memories of her struggles resurfaced, selling small products, saving every dollar, while Daniel often complained about their modest life. But Natalie never gave up. She pushed forward until she earned investors' trust and built everything standing before her today. When it was time for the main speech, the host invited Daniel to the stage as Chief Operating Officer to give a brief address before Natalie delivered the keynote as CEO. Daniel stepped onto the stage confidently. He took the microphone and scanned the room with a hard-to-read expression. Natalie applauded proudly from below the stage, believing her husband would thank the staff and celebrate their success together. But within seconds, the atmosphere turned chilling. Daniel did not begin with gratitude. His voice rose with arrogance and dominance. He declared that the company needed strong leadership and that men were the true leaders in business. At first, the guests assumed it was an awkward joke, but Daniel's face showed no hint of humor. Suddenly, he pulled a folder of documents from behind the podium and raised it high. Effective immediately, he announced a massive restructuring of company ownership and management. According to the documents, he now had full control of the company. Natalie froze. She stepped forward slightly, assuming there had been some mistake or some bizarre surprise. But Daniel's sharp stare pierced her as if he were her enemy rather than the woman who had built his life. In front of investors, executives, and employees, Daniel pointed directly at Natalie. His voice echoed coldly through the speakers. He declared that Natalie was no longer competent to lead the company. Then came the words that silenced the entire hall. "You're fired." He ordered her to pack her belongings immediately and instructed security to drag her out if she resisted. All eyes turned to Natalie. Whispers spread throughout the room, some sympathetic, some confused, some openly judgmental. In the front row stood Melissa Carter, Daniel's executive secretary, smiling triumphantly. She even clapped softly, enjoying Natalie's humiliation. Natalie's heart felt like it stopped. Betrayal burned through her veins. Shame, anger, and heartbreak collided. But Natalie Wilson was not a fragile woman. She took a deep breath. Her shocked expression slowly transformed into an unnervingly calm one. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Natalie walked toward the reception desk near the entrance while all eyes followed her. Robert Hayes, the head of security, approached nervously and apologized, saying he was only following orders. Natalie nodded calmly, signaling she understood. She removed the CEO badge hanging around her neck, the symbol of years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. She looked at it briefly, then snapped it cleanly in half. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room. Then she placed the broken badge on the desk. Then she picked up a plain visitor badge, the kind worn by delivery staff or ordinary guests, and calmly placed it around her neck. She adjusted her shawl, lifted her head, and locked eyes with Daniel standing arrogantly on the stage. There were no tears, only the cold gaze of a business strategist calculating her opponent's downfall. Daniel laughed mockingly, convinced he had already won. He didn't realize that Natalie's silence was far more dangerous than any outburst. Now standing as a visitor in her own company, Natalie listened as Daniel ordered security to remove her. Melissa stepped closer to the stage, staring at Natalie with open contempt, imagining herself occupying the luxurious CEO office. Daniel descended from the stage and wrapped his arm around Melissa's waist in public, shamelessly displaying his betrayal. But before security could escort Natalie out, she did something no one expected. She turned toward the company's senior executive secretary standing pale near the door and said calmly but firmly, loud enough to be heard, "Please inform all staff that the primary board of directors will hold an emergency meeting." Her tone was flat, emotionless, like a superior assigning a routine task. Daniel burst into laughter. "What board?" he mocked. "I own this company now." He believed Natalie had lost her mind from shock. Natalie didn't respond. She glanced at him once, cold and dismissive, then whispered softly, just loud enough for him to hear, "Enjoy that chair for the next 119 minutes. Then she turned and walked out of the building with unwavering steps. Robert and the other security guards followed her, not to expel her, but instinctively escorting her like a queen. To them, Natalie Wilson was still their true leader. Once Natalie disappeared through the glass doors of the lobby, Daniel took full control of the event. He ordered the party to continue and had expensive drinks poured for everyone. Daniel and Melissa headed toward the executive elevator, laughing as they celebrated their corporate coup. Inside the elevator, Melissa praised Daniel's bravery, saying they could finally enjoy the company's wealth openly. Daniel arrogantly claimed Natalie had been too weak and foolish to trust him with important documents. They believed the world was now in their hands. Upon arriving at the CEO office, Daniel dropped into Natalie's large leather chair, spinning it joyfully. Melissa began opening cabinets, examining the belongings inside, planning to throw everything away. They summoned several managers into the office, convinced the empire was finally theirs. They had no idea their time was already running out. Without hesitation, Daniel Wilson began firing several senior managers, those he knew were fiercely loyal to Natalie Wilson. He replaced them with people he had long known to be corruptible, individuals willing to cooperate in dirty dealings. The atmosphere on the executive floors descended into chaos. Employees were terrified. Some broke down in tears after being abruptly terminated without any clear severance. Daniel and Melissa Carter were intoxicated with power. They ordered extravagant meals from the most expensive restaurant in the city, charging everything to the company's corporate credit cards. Meanwhile, outside the building, Natalie did not go home to cry into a pillow. She entered her private car parked in the guest area and sat quietly in the back seat. She took her phone from her bag, her expression calm and focused. She dialed a number saved under the name Harold Adams. The call connected immediately. A deep, elderly voice answered with respect. Natalie gave a short, decisive command. "The time has come." She instructed Harold to prepare the holding company documents and immediately contact Mr. David Parker, along with the entire board of foreign investors. She informed him that Daniel had made the exact foolish move they had anticipated and that it was time to teach him a real lesson. Harold replied promptly that everything would be handled. In truth, Natalie had sensed her husband's betrayal long ago. The company Daniel now controlled, the one so proudly inaugurated, was merely a subsidiary, a shell. All critical assets, patents, land, factories, intellectual property, and core capital were securely held within the holding company, Wilson Holdings, whose shares were 100% registered under Natalie Wilson's name. Thanks to a prenuptial agreement and a carefully designed inheritance structure, the holding company was entirely separate from marital assets. Daniel, lacking deep knowledge of corporate law, only saw what was on the surface. He believed by seizing control of the subsidiary, he owned everything. He had no idea he had taken over a ship while the engine remained firmly in Natalie's hands. Time passed steadily. Inside her car, Natalie opened her laptop and accessed the company's security system, directly linked to the servers at Wilson Holdings. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. She didn't shut the system down. Instead, she began locking financial access, one channel at a time. She blocked the flow of funds from the holding company to the operational accounts now controlled by Daniel. Red notifications flashed across her screen. Access denied. Natalie allowed herself a faint smile. This was only the beginning. She glanced at her watch. There was still an hour and a half before the board meeting she had announced. She wanted Daniel and Melissa to fly as high as possible so that when they fell, the impact would shatter every bone of their arrogance. Inside the building, Daniel began to sense something was wrong. When he attempted to transfer company funds into his personal account as a success bonus, the transaction failed. He tried again. Failed. Assuming it was a temporary network issue due to the event, he brushed it off and resumed celebrating with Melissa. They had no idea that outside, luxury black-plated cars were arriving one by one, carrying the real power brokers, the true capital owners, people who answered to only one name: Natalie Wilson. The real storm was approaching the CEO's office, and Daniel had no umbrella to protect himself. 1 hour after Natalie's dramatic removal, the private party on the executive floor continued. Expensive liquor bottles, taken from Natalie's personal vault, were scattered across the large mahogany table. Melissa lounged at the far end, feet propped up, snapping selfies in the lavish office to show off on social media. She imagined thousands of likes and admiring comments flooding her account. Daniel reclined in the CEO chair, feeling like the king of the world. He summoned the newly appointed HR manager, chosen at random, and ordered them to fire anyone who looked unhappy with his leadership. The floor was filled with suppressed panic. Employees worked in fear, lowering their heads whenever Daniel or Melissa passed by, terrified to become the next target. The first crack appeared over something trivial. Melissa tried to book first-class tickets to Europe for their vacation using the corporate credit card Daniel had just taken from the desk drawer. Transaction declined. She frowned, assuming the payment terminal was malfunctioning. Daniel waved it off, saying they had direct access to company accounts and could handle it later. But the real problem arrived moments after. The phone on Daniel's desk rang. It was the finance division. The newly appointed finance manager, voice shaking, reported they could not process payment for the inauguration catering. The vendor demanded upfront payment due to the massive order, but every transfer attempt was rejected by the system. Daniel exploded. He shouted that he was the new owner and ordered the bank to restore access immediately. He didn't realize the bank hadn't blocked anything. The digital authorization token had been remotely changed. Before he could finish yelling, another phone rang. This time, the call was international. Daniel answered confidently, assuming it was a congratulations call from an overseas partner. Instead, a cold, sharp voice filled the line. It was Mr. David Parker, the largest investor representative from Singapore. Without pleasantries, Mr. Parker delivered a threat. With a firm British accent, he stated that they had received notification of an unauthorized management change. He warned Daniel that the investor consortium would withdraw $70 million in funding unless Natalie Wilson was reinstated as CEO within 1 hour. Daniel tried to lie, claiming Natalie was ill and he was temporarily filling in. Mr. Parker ended the call abruptly. The dead tone echoed in Daniel's ears. Cold sweat formed on his temples. Panic crept across his face. A withdrawal of $70 million would bankrupt the company within days. Daniel immediately summoned the legal team. He shouted for Harold Adams, the chief legal officer he had always considered slow and easy to control. Harold entered calmly, carrying a thick stack of documents. His expression was neutral, unlike the panic gripping everyone else. Daniel demanded explanations, shouting about angry investors and frozen financial access. He ordered Harold to draft legal letters declaring the investors' actions illegal. Harold placed the documents on the desk. In an even, composed voice, he began explaining facts Daniel had never understood. He opened a document, the company's founding charter. He explained that the company Daniel now seized, Wilson Operations, LLC, was merely a subsidiary. Its role was limited to daily operations, salaries, and liabilities. Daniel stared blankly. Harold continued, calmly but mercilessly. All valuable assets, the building, factory land, patents, and core capital belong to another entity, Wilson Holdings, whose shares were 100% owned by Natalie Wilson. Worse, a clause stated that any management change in the subsidiary without written consent from the holding owner allowed the holding company to terminate all contracts, reclaim all assets, and transfer all subsidiary debts to the acting director. Daniel's face drained of color. He realized too late he had taken over an empty shell filled with debt, while the real treasure had already been secured by Natalie. Melissa began trembling. "So we get nothing?" she shrieked. "Where's the money?" Daniel couldn't answer. Suddenly, the lights in the office flickered. The power went out. Melissa screamed. Seconds later, the electricity returned, but something was different. Every monitor in the room lit up simultaneously. The company wallpaper vanished, replaced by the gold-accented logo of Wilson Holdings. A board profile appeared. At the center of the board was Natalie Wilson, chairwoman and sole owner, smiling with quiet authority. Below her image, a message appeared. System locked by Wilson Holdings. Daniel slammed the keyboard. No. The skyscraper headquarters of Wilson Global Enterprises, which had been buzzing with celebration only hours earlier, was now engulfed in suffocating tension. On the ground floor, the atmosphere had changed completely. Where the lobby had once been filled with flower arrangements and relaxed party guests, it was now occupied by tall, broad-shouldered men in immaculate black suits, discreet earpieces tucked behind their ears. They were the elite security detail of an international investor consortium. Luxury vehicles with black diplomatic-style plates and small foreign flags began arriving one by one, stopping directly at the main entrance. These were no ordinary cars, a lineup of Rolls-Royces and Maybach Mercedes carrying individuals whose signatures alone could shake national economies. The receptionists on duty stared in stunned silence. They had never witnessed such a gathering of power in one place, not even during the grand opening earlier that morning. From one of the cars stepped Mr. David Parker, the principal investor from Singapore. His face was flushed, barely containing his fury. Behind him emerged a representative from Japan, Mr. Kenji Tanaka, a man infamous for his discipline and zero tolerance for even the smallest mistake. They had not come to celebrate. Their faces were rigid, their steps were fast, sharp, and decisive. No smiles, no pleasantries. They moved straight toward the VIP elevator, its access automatically unlocked by the building's central system, a system still fully under the control of Natalie Wilson. Standing guard in front of the elevator, Robert Hayes, head of security, bowed deeply. Cold sweat streamed down his forehead. He knew it. The storm had truly arrived. Upstairs, the CEO floor. Inside the CEO office, Daniel Wilson sat slumped in his chair, drenched in sweat. The room felt unbearably hot. The central air conditioning had been deliberately shut down by the system. He loosened his tie, which felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Melissa Carter paced back and forth anxiously, ranting nonstop about how unfair the situation was. But Daniel wasn't listening. His mind was completely blank. Suddenly, the CEO door was thrown open violently. Two members of the investor security team entered without knocking. In cold, clipped voices, without a shred of courtesy, they ordered Daniel to immediately proceed to the main boardroom on the same floor. Daniel tried to resist. "I'm the owner of this company. You can't order me around." They didn't care. One of the guards grabbed Daniel's arm with a crushing force and yanked him to his feet. Daniel winced in pain. His ego shattered instantly as he was dragged out of his own office like a criminal. Melissa tried to protest, but one sharp glare from the security officer made her shrink back into silence. She was forced to follow behind Daniel. The boardroom. They were pushed into the main boardroom, a vast, imposing space dominated by a long oval table made of polished ebony wood. The room was ice cold, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the CEO office. Every leather chair around the table was already occupied. International investors, newly seated commissioners, board members with expressions carved from stone. Their eyes pierced Daniel the moment he entered. There was no empty seat for him, except one, a small, armless chair placed in the far corner of the room, away from the table. A deliberate humiliation. Daniel stood frozen, unsure what to do. He searched the faces before him for even a hint of sympathy. There was none, only disgust and open hostility. Suddenly, Mr. David Parker slammed his fist down on the table. "Sit down," he barked. Daniel flinched and hurriedly collapsed onto the small chair. His knees trembled uncontrollably. Silence followed, but it was a silence so dense it felt like it could be cut with a knife. All eyes shifted toward the head of the table. One chair remained empty. The chairman's seat. Her entrance. The boardroom door opened slowly. This time there was no force, only the steady, measured sound of footsteps entering the room. Every investor, including Mr. Parker and the notoriously arrogant Mr. Tanaka, rose to their feet simultaneously in respect. Daniel turned. His eyes widened in horror. Natalie Wilson had entered. She was no longer wearing the elegant party dress from that morning. Now she wore a dark navy business blazer paired with a silver-gray silk shawl. Her appearance was flawless, elite, commanding. She radiated absolute authority. There was no trace of the woman who had been publicly expelled earlier that day. Natalie walked straight ahead, posture perfect, gaze unwavering, passing Daniel without even glancing at him, as if he didn't exist. She reached the head of the table, placed a slim folder neatly on the surface, and surveyed the investors one by one. She gave a subtle nod. They all sat down. Only then did Natalie take her seat. She rotated her chair slightly, facing Daniel in the corner. A faint smile touched her lips, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Welcome to the real Board of Directors meeting," Natalie said softly, her voice echoing through the silent room. "As I promised 2 hours ago, we will now discuss the future of the company and the fate of the stowaways who tried to hijack this ship." Daniel swallowed hard. He realized then this was not a meeting, this was a trial. And the judge was the woman he had betrayed. The verdict begins. Natalie opened her folder. There were no messy stacks of paper, just a few crucial documents and a small flash drive. She inserted the drive into the conference table's port. The massive projector screen behind her lit up. Financial data filled the screen, complex yet presented with crystal-clear charts. The title glared boldly: Internal Investigative Audit, Misappropriation of Funds, Asset Manipulation. Daniel's eyes bulged. His heart began to race. He knew he had taken some company money for personal use, but he never imagined an audit this thorough. Natalie spoke, calmly. No raised voice, no emotion, like a professor delivering a lecture. "Ladies and gentlemen," Natalie began, "for the past 6 months I suspected budget leakage within the operational division. Initially, I assumed it was simple inefficiency." She clicked the remote. The screen shifted to a list of suspicious transactions. However, after my forensic audit team conducted a discreet investigation, a pattern emerged. Large sums of money had been transferred to a shell company named Bright Forward Consulting. "That company," Natalie continued, "is registered under the name of Miss Melissa Carter's distant cousin. The funds were listed as marketing consulting fees. There was no marketing activity, none whatsoever. The amount totaled $70 million US. Every single disbursement approval, Natalie said calmly, was signed by one person. She turned her gaze toward Daniel. Daniel Wilson. Daniel shot up from his chair, shaking. "This is slander. Those were confidential business strategies. I had full authority over operational budgets." His voice cracked in the heavy silence. Mr. Tanaka stared at him with open contempt and spoke in perfect English. "Business strategy? Buying luxury handbags and watches for your secretary? You call that strategy?" He threw a stack of photographs on the table. They showed Daniel and Melissa shopping at high-end boutiques overseas on the exact same dates those funds were withdrawn. Daniel was speechless. He hadn't known the investors had hired private investigators. Behind the scenes, Natalie had coordinated everything. The final blow. Natalie advanced to the...
It felt as if all the oxygen in the room had been sucked away by the weight of Daniel Wilson's crimes. The investors, who had been sitting in cold silence, began to stand one by one. The harsh scraping of chairs against the floor echoed through the boardroom, creating a rhythm of tension that made the hair on the back of the neck stand on end. Mr. David Parker, the Singapore-based investor who had been restraining his fury, walked toward Daniel, who was still slumped helplessly on the carpeted floor. David's tall, imposing figure blocked the overhead lights, casting a long shadow over Daniel, making him feel smaller, weaker, and utterly powerless. Without a trace of mercy, Mr. Parker pointed directly at Daniel's face and spoke in a low, threatening voice. He declared that the losses suffered by the International Investor Consortium due to Daniel's incompetent and reckless management over the past 6 months must be repaid in full, or Daniel would rot in an international prison for violating foreign investment contracts. Daniel's entire body trembled violently. His lips moved, desperate to speak, to defend himself, but no sound came out. His throat was locked by sheer terror. The legal clause. At that moment, Harold Adams, the meticulous chief legal officer, stepped forward. He calmly removed an additional document from his briefcase. With a flat, emotionless tone, Harold began reading aloud an indemnity clause, a personal liability agreement Daniel had signed when he was appointed director of operations. Back then, Daniel had signed it without reading a single word, intoxicated by his new title and power. The clause stated that if a director committed a criminal act or gross negligence that caused financial harm to the company, all personal assets belonging to that director would be seized as compensation. Harold explained in precise detail that those assets included the house Daniel lived in, the sports cars he proudly flaunted, even his retirement savings. Daniel's eyes widened in horror. Only then did he realize he wasn't just being fired, he was being stripped down to the bone. Total financial destruction. Panic surged through Daniel's body. With shaking hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He frantically opened his banking app, hoping, praying that there might still be some money left he could transfer to a hidden account. The screen loaded. Daniel's eyes bulged. A massive zero balance stared back at him. Then came a red notification. Account status frozen. By order of financial authorities. Suspected money laundering. His breath caught. He tried another account, then another. Savings, deposits, even his digital wallets. All frozen. Every single one.
his financial access had been completely cut off, the exact moment Natalie Wilson had begun her presentation earlier. Daniel felt his world spin. That morning, he had felt like a king holding tens of millions of dollars in his hands. Now, he didn't even have enough money to buy a bottle of water. Melissa breaks. In the corner of the room, Melissa Carter, who had overheard Harold's explanation, began to lose her grip on reality. Her beautiful face, once covered in flawless makeup, was now streaked with tears and cold sweat. She knew it. Daniel was finished. And if Daniel was finished, the luxurious life she dreamed of would vanish with him. Her survival instinct kicked in. She wasn't going down with this sinking ship. Suddenly, Melissa jumped up from her chair and bolted toward a side exit she assumed was unguarded. She knocked over a chair, sending it crashing to the floor with a loud clatter. Her mind raced. If I can get out of this building now, I can flee the city, I can sell my jewelry, I can disappear. She underestimated the investor's security team. After barely 3 meters, 2 large security officers blocked her path. Melissa screamed hysterically, scratching at their arms, trying to force her way through. But she was no match. They effortlessly twisted her arms behind her back and restrained her. Melissa shrieked hysterically, cursing the guards, then turned on Daniel. She screamed at the top of her lungs, blaming him for everything, shouting that it had all been Daniel's idea, that she was merely a victim forced to comply. Her piercing screams plunged the room into further chaos. Daniel stared at her blankly. The woman who once claimed she would die for him now attacked him like a starving wolf the moment he fell. Daniel's heart shattered. The betrayal he had committed against his wife was now being repaid immediately and mercilessly by the betrayal of his mistress. Karma had arrived swiftly and brutally. Natalie's silence. The investors watched the cheap drama with visible disgust. Mr. Tanaka shook his head, muttering in Japanese about how dishonorable such people were. In the midst of all the chaos, Melissa screaming while being restrained, Daniel slumped on the floor staring at his empty phone screen, Natalie Wilson remained seated calmly in her chair. She did not appear to enjoy their suffering, nor did she appear to pity them. Her expression was flat, like a judge who had seen criminals cry 1,000 times before. Slowly, she gathered her documents, returned the flash drive to her bag, and stood up. Her composed movements stood in stark contrast to the chaos around her. The moment Natalie arose, her authority silenced the room. Melissa stopped screaming. Daniel looked up. Natalie said nothing to them. She simply gave a respectful nod to Mr. Parker and Mr. Tanaka. Then she turned and walked toward the main exit. Daniel's last hope. Seeing Natalie about to leave, Daniel's awareness snapped back. He realized the only person who could save him from prison and complete ruin was the very woman he had cast aside. His last hope rested on his wife's mercy. Daniel forced himself to stand. His legs felt like jelly. He staggered forward, chasing Natalie's retreating figure down the corridor. His breathing was ragged. Tears poured freely down his face. He was no longer an arrogant executive. He was a desperate man running for his life. The corridor of truth. The long corridor leading to the executive elevator felt like a time tunnel. In the glass walls, Daniel caught his reflection. Crooked tie, disheveled hair, red, tear-stained face. A far cry from the confident man he had seen in the mirror that morning. At the far end, Natalie walked with steady, unhurried steps. She never looked back, even though she could clearly hear Daniel's staggering footsteps and hoarse cries calling her name. In the elevator lobby, dozens of senior staff, managers, and employees had gathered. those who had been expelled earlier and those who had stayed behind. They whispered nervously, waiting to see what would happen. When Natalie emerged with a calm expression, they bowed respectfully and made way for her. But when they saw Daniel stumbling after her, the whispers erupted. Daniel no longer cared about his pride. He didn't care about being watched by subordinates he had yelled at that morning. He only had one thought: I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to be poor. On his knees. As Natalie paused briefly while waiting for the elevator doors to open, Daniel saw his chance. Summoning the last of his strength, he lunged forward and threw himself at her feet. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor. Both arms wrapped tightly around Natalie's right leg, preventing her from stepping into the elevator. Gasps filled the lobby. The sight was shocking. The same Director Wilson who had stood on stage that morning, firing his wife, was now kneeling at her feet like a slave, begging his master for mercy. "Natalie, my husband!" Daniel screamed hysterically, his voice breaking between sobs. "Please, don't leave me like this. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I'll fix everything. Don't let them put me in prison. I'm your husband, Natalie, your husband." He buried his face into the hem of her high-quality business attire, soaking the fabric with tears. He rambled incoherently, recalling memories of their early struggles, trying to awaken pity in her heart. He believed, deep down, that Natalie still loved him, that she would bend down, hold him, and say everything would be okay. His hope shattered completely when Natalie didn't move. Not even an inch. No hand reached out to lift him, no gentle voice tried to comfort him. Natalie stood rigid, like a stone statue. Slowly, she lowered her head and looked.
And now, after I've taken everything back, now you finally realize that you need me? Natalie Wilson let out a long, steady breath, as if releasing a burden she had carried for far too many years. "You know, Daniel," she said calmly, "when I walked out of this building 2 hours ago with that guest card in my hand, I also carried away the last remnants of a heart that once belonged to you. The man kneeling at my feet right now is not my husband. You are nothing more than a former employee guilty of corruption, and in this company, we do not tolerate corrupt individuals." Those words struck Daniel harder than any physical blow. His strength drained away, his grip around Natalie's ankle slowly loosened, though he still struggled to cling on. "Natalie, please," he begged hoarsely, "just give me one chance." Natalie Wilson did not respond. With a firm yet graceful movement, she shifted her foot, lightly shaking Daniel's hand loose from her ankle. Completely out of strength, Daniel released his grip and collapsed face down on the marble floor. Natalie stepped back, looking down at her work shoes, the same shoes Daniel had just clutched and soaked with tears. Then she did something that would be remembered by every employee who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. She pulled a tissue from her handbag. Calmly, she bent slightly and wiped the part of her shoe Daniel had touched, as if removing something filthy and repulsive. She wiped slowly and carefully, ensuring the leather was once again spotless and gleaming. When she finished, she dropped the used tissue directly in front of Daniel as he lay on the floor. "Take this trash with you when you leave," Natalie said coldly. The elevator doors opened at the perfect moment. Natalie stepped inside, leaving Daniel behind, howling hysterically on the lobby floor, watched by dozens of eyes filled with a mix of pity and disgust. The elevator doors closed slowly, separating Natalie's world, returning to the height of power, from Daniel's world, which had just collapsed into absolute ruin. Inside the main executive boardroom, the atmosphere now felt like a glass prison suffocating Melissa Carter. Just hours earlier, she had walked with her chin held high, wearing a triumphant smile. Now she stood frozen beside the long conference table, both arms firmly restrained by the muscular security officers hired by the investors, preventing any attempt to escape. She scanned the room desperately, searching for a weakness, for hope, or at least for a friendly face. She found none. Only cold walls of expressionless investors and board members stared back at her. There was no sympathy in their eyes, only judgment and open disgust. Daniel Wilson, the man who had fueled her ambition, now lay broken in the corner after humiliating himself in the lobby. The sight of his collapse triggered a fresh wave of panic inside her. She realized then that her defenses were completely gone. There was no CEO left to protect her, no financial access left to fund an escape. She was alone, trapped in a web she herself had helped weave. Her mind raced under a surge of terror-driven adrenaline. She refused to end like this. She refused to wear a prison uniform and rot behind steel bars. In desperation, her manipulative instincts took over. Her gaze locked onto Richard Moore, a senior board commissioner seated at the far end of the table. Richard Moore was a middle-aged man known for his weakness towards attractive women. Melissa remembered how he often stole glances at her during meetings, how he'd complimented her appearance with a tone just a little too suggestive. This was her last card. Summoning every ounce of her acting skill, Melissa let tears spill down her cheeks, allowing her makeup to run in a way she hoped looked pitiful, yet still alluring. She lowered herself, making her body appear small and fragile. With a trembling voice, she begged the security officer's permission to speak briefly with Richard Moore, or at least lend her enough cash to return to her hometown and disappear forever. Then, in a whisper both desperate and repulsive, she promised loyalty and personal services of any kind if he would save her. Her hope shattered instantly. Richard Moore recoiled in visible fear and disgust, yanking his arm away as if he had just touched a diseased animal. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. His face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with anger and shame at being associated with Melissa Carter in front of international business partners. In a booming voice, Richard Moore shouted, warning her never to touch him again. He declared that everyone in the room had already reviewed the forensic audit evidence. Melissa's digital trail was undeniable. Illegal transfer approvals, luxury displays on social media funded by stolen money. No one believed her tears. With cutting sarcasm, Moore added that he was not foolish enough to destroy his reputation and marriage for a petty fraudster. His wife, he pointed out, was well acquainted with Natalie Wilson, and helping Melissa would amount to social suicide. The rejection hit Melissa harder than a slap. She collapsed on the floor, her face drained of color as soft, mocking laughter echoed from several investors. Her beauty, her charm, her manipulative talents, once her greatest weapons, were now completely useless. To these people, she was nothing more than a parasite to be removed. Before she could even process her humiliation, the double doors of the boardroom swang open. The atmosphere instantly turned severe and oppressive. 2 uniformed police officers entered with firm, authoritative steps, accompanied by Harold Adams, chief legal officer, carrying an official case file. The heavy sound of their boots against the carpet filled the room. Harold Adams stepped forward, pointing towards Melissa on the floor and Daniel, now dragged back inside by security. In a calm yet commanding voice, Adams announced that both individuals were the primary suspects in a corporate embezzlement scheme, bank document forgery, and organized financial fraud. He handed over the physical evidence.
The police moved immediately. One officer produced a pair of cold, gleaming handcuffs. At the sight of them, Melissa completely lost control. She screamed hysterically, crawling backward and shouting that this was unfair, that she was innocent. The officers acted swiftly and professionally, pulling her arms behind her back. The sharp click of metal locking around her wrists echoed like a death knell, marking the end of her freedom. Across the room, Daniel offered no resistance as he was handcuffed. He simply lowered his head, tears and mucus streaking his ruined face. Seeing his silence, Melissa's rage exploded. She felt betrayed twice over. The man who promised her the world had delivered her straight to prison. She lunged at Daniel, kicking his leg with her high heel despite her restraints, screaming obscenities and blaming him for everything. She cursed him as a useless, incompetent man who had dragged her into destruction and even spat in his face in front of the police and investors. Daniel finally snapped. He shouted back, accusing Melissa of draining company funds for her luxury lifestyle, listing every branded item she demanded, forcing him, he claimed, to manipulate financial reports. They screamed, accused, and exposed each other's secrets like trapped animals tearing at each other. It was grotesque. The couple who had stood together just hours earlier as king and queen of the day now fought like feral creatures in a cage. Police and security forcibly separated them. Melissa continued screaming as she was dragged from the boardroom, her shrill cries echoing down the executive corridor. Employees and staff outside watched in stunned silence, some shocked, some shaking their heads, many quietly satisfied. They saw the once arrogant Melissa Carter, who had humiliated subordinates, now disheveled, makeup smeared, wrists shackled in steel. Daniel followed behind her, head bowed deeply, unable to meet the eyes of those he once commanded. This was the ultimate walk of shame, the most brutal parade of humiliation imaginable. Every pair of eyes fixed on them was a form of social punishment, sharp and merciless. Melissa Carter and Daniel Wilson were escorted into a cargo elevator, the kind normally reserved for garbage and contaminated goods. The VIP elevator had been permanently locked to them. The metal doors slid shut slowly, sealing them off from the world of luxury they had tasted only briefly, carrying them downward toward the police transport vehicle waiting in the lower lobby, ready to deliver them into a bleak new reality behind iron bars. 1 month later, the storm that had rocked Wilson Global Enterprises had long passed. Time moved strangely. For some, it crawled. For the company, however, that single month felt like a swift and refreshing rebirth. The skyscraper standing tall in the heart of the city now radiated a different energy. Where once the corridors were thick with fear, whispered anxiety, and strained faces shaped by toxic leadership, the air now felt lighter. Sunlight streaming through the glass wall seemed brighter, illuminating workspaces filled with genuine collaboration. No employees feared arbitrary termination over trivial matters. No sycophants climbed the ranks through personal favoritism. In the main lobby, a symbolic yet powerful change had taken place. The large, arrogant portrait of Daniel Wilson that once dominated the reception wall had been taken down and destroyed. In its place hung a beautiful abstract painting, beneath which the company's new motto was written in elegant lettering: "Integrity is the foundation." Despite holding absolute control as the majority shareholder, Natalie chose not to display her own image narcissistically. Instead, she allowed the company's values to take center stage. Harold Adams, the loyal and meticulous man instrumental in exposing the corruption of the former management, was appointed interim chief operating officer. Under his steady and disciplined leadership, the company's systems were rebuilt from the ground up. Financial loopholes once exploited by Daniel and Melissa were sealed with layered, transparent audit systems. Investor confidence rebounded rapidly. In fact, company shares surged higher than they had ever been before the scandal. Thousands of miles away from the headquarters hustle and bustle, Natalie Wilson sat calmly at a small outdoor cafe along a quiet Paris street. Autumn had embraced the city. Trees lined the boulevard, shedding golden and amber leaves that danced in the cool breeze. Natalie wore no rigid blazer, no document-filled briefcase. Instead, she appeared relaxed, yet elegant, wrapped in a long, thick wool coat that shielded her from the chill. Her shawl fluttered gently in the wind, framing a face that now looked lighter, free of exhaustion and pressure. There were no lines of strain in her eyes, only deep peace, the kind of peace earned by someone who has survived the fiercest storm of her life. On the small round table before her lay a tablet displaying international business news. One headline caught her attention immediately. Former CEO and corporate secretary of Wilson Global Enterprises sentenced to 10 years in prison and fined tens of millions of dollars. Natalie took a slow sip of her hot Earl Grey tea and continued reading with a neutral expression, neither hatred nor misplaced pity. The article detailed a trial that was swift yet devastating for both defendants. Daniel Wilson and Melissa Carter were handed maximum sentences due to premeditated intent and massive financial damages totaling $70 million. Their courtroom photos filled the screen, both wearing bright orange prison vests, their faces gaunt, aged, and hopeless. The contrast to their glamorous appearances just a month earlier was stark. The report went on to describe their grim futures. All of Daniel's personal assets, his luxury mansions, sports cars, and even inherited land had been seized and auctioned by the state. The proceeds were still insufficient to cover the losses, resulting in additional prison time in lieu of payment. He was left completely bankrupt, stripped to absolute zero. Nothing would await him upon release except old age and a permanent criminal record. Melissa's fate was no less tragic. In addition to her sentence, it was revealed she carried massive online loan debts, once serviced using stolen corporate funds. With no income, the interest ballooned uncontrollably. Debt collectors now harassed her family daily, forcing them to disown her out of shame. The woman who once dreamed of living like royalty now faced the harsh reality of life as an inmate with no future. Karma did not arrive halfway. It came to finish its work thoroughly. Natalie set down her teacup and exhaled deeply, not in sorrow, but in relief. It felt as though she had finally removed a rotting blockage that had long poisoned the air in her life. Reaching for her leather wallet to pay the bill, her eyes caught sight of a plain white plastic card tucked behind her credit cards. A visitor badge, the cheap kind worn by couriers or unknown guests. She pulled it out and stared at it intently. This simple object carried countless memories. The pain of being publicly expelled by Daniel, the cold plastic against her neck as she walked out with her head held high, the moment she placed it on the table to begin the board meeting that reversed everything. It symbolized both her lowest point and her turning point. But Natalie realized something important. She no longer needed to keep symbols of pain. She was no longer a victim clinging to old wounds for strength. She had healed. She had won. Keeping the card would only anchor her to the past. She smiled softly at it, a farewell smile. "Thank you for staying with me on my worst day," she whispered. Rising from her chair, she walked slowly to an artistic metal trash bin by the sidewalk. Around her, Paris pulsed with life. Laughter, couples holding hands, children running freely. Life moved forward, lightly, without hesitation. She released the card. The white plastic fluttered briefly before landing silently among the trash. The sound was barely audible, yet its emotional impact was profound. "Unwelcome guests must be shown the door," she murmured. She didn't look back. Turning away, she walked along the cobblestone street toward the Eiffel Tower shimmering in the distance, ready to enjoy the rest of her vacation, ready to begin a new chapter, ready to embrace a future unshadowed by betrayal. She was no longer just a corporate leader. She was whole again. 5 years later, on the outskirts of the city, far from glass towers and boardrooms, a dull concrete structure topped with barbed wire loomed, a maximum security prison for white-collar criminals. Inside the humid cafeteria, a thin man with graying hair and deep wrinkles ate silently. The rice was hard, the vegetables tasteless, nothing like the imported steaks and fine wine he once consumed daily. It was Daniel Wilson, not yet 50, but worn into the likeness of an old man. When a flickering television aired a special feature on Asia's most influential business leader, the screen showed Natalie Wilson, radiant, powerful, accepting a gold trophy under crystal lights. An inmate beside Daniel nudged him, joking that her husband must be the luckiest man alive. The words crushed Daniel's chest. He wanted to scream that it was him, but shame sealed his mouth. He lowered his head as tears fell into his tray. Meanwhile, at Wilson Holdings headquarters, the atmosphere was vibrant and hopeful. Robert Hayes, now head of security, confidently led his team in the renovated lobby. His loyalty during the crisis had been rewarded. Harold Adams, retired, was honored as a legendary advisor. At the top floor, Natalie Wilson stood by the window. Her gold trophy rested casually on the desk. Her greatest reward was peace. She glanced at her watch. Soon she would dine with the children from the orphanage she sponsored. As she stepped into the elevator, a phoenix painting caught her eye. She smiled. She no longer remembered Daniel or Melissa. The best revenge, she knew, was living so well that her enemies no longer mattered. The doors closed. Justice had been served perfectly.